Hey there, and welcome to another week here in Biogeography. This week we are getting into some evolutionary stuff. We're sort of it's a little bit of a continuation of what we were doing last week, but putting stuff more into an evolutionary perspective and a history of lineages perspective. But before I get into that, there is some housekeeping stuff I want to go over. I guess mainly the one thing that I want to discuss here is I just want to point out that if you're thinking about your courses, what you're going to take for next fall, there's a number of really cool courses here in the geography department that are being offered that you should definitely consider. So here's a list of the courses that are being offered for next semester, fall 2021. So if you're considering doing a geography major, or if you are, or a minor, I would definitely encourage you. If you're not one of those, I would encourage you to consider it, or at least consider taking some of these courses. I think the really cool thing about geography, and I think I said this about what makes biogeography cool, is that there's really something for everybody. If you're studying pretty much anything on a spatial scale, then all of a sudden you're doing geography. So you can take whatever topic you might be interested in and put that on a spatial scale, and bam, you're doing geography. So there really is something, no matter what you're interested in. It's a really cool, it's a great department, and we have lots of really cool classes that are being taught by really great faculty. So consider some adding some of these courses if you're thinking about, if you're major, if you're undecided, or you don't have a minor yet, or whatever it is. Keep geography in the back of your mind there. And it's really something else that's worth mentioning here really quickly is that job opportunities are great. Employers love people with geographic skill sets, and that's only going to continue, especially if you're doing stuff like GIS or remote sensing, environmental stuff. But even other areas of geography are really in demand. So definitely consider that. It would benefit you and in your future career choices. And this stuff is just cool and interesting. So keep it in mind. Okay, so getting into the lecture and stuff here, and I'll make sure to post that list of geography courses to Canvas so you can have that. But okay, so I want to get into lecture stuff now. Like I said, this week we're talking about sort of evolutionary, putting some spatial stuff in evolutionary context. And so I want to come back to this idea that I introduced, I think last week, where we said evolution occurs across space and time. And so to study it, we have to study both the history of place and the history of lineage. Now, we definitely looked at the history of place quite a bit, a few weeks ago when we were talking about plate tectonics and how the geologic history and things that happened during the Pleistocene. We're getting more into history of lineage now. Last week we sort of combined these things and looked at some spatial evolutionary patterns, but we're really going to dig into and expand on that evolutionary stuff this week. So I want to sort of mention some trends in this area. I don't know that I necessarily consider evolutionary and systematics and phylogenetics a new science. It's not new. But it has seen a rapid increase lately due to, I guess, in the past few decades, due to a number of things. One is the increase in high quality phylogenetic trees. Over time you collect more data, and more data can yield new insights, and then you can use those new insights to make even more insights. So that's been something that's happened recently. There's been an increase in phylogenetically based analysis. And so basically, while this isn't a new science, it sort of took off maybe in the 60s and then died off a little bit, and is now seeing sort of a renewal. And some of that's due to this, where we have this expanded computing and statistical power. So we have a lot of data that's accumulated, and we have the development of some new methods and new data, using technology, where we can really expand. We have all these new tools available to us, and can really do some much more powerful statistical analyses and get some better insights into evolutionary relationships that way. So that's been part of the cause of this rapid increase in this field of science. Okay, so I want to, in this first video, just sort of give a background of what systematics is. People may not be coming from sort of a background of biology or evolution and things like that, so I want to sort of talk about what this is. And there's a few different approaches to systematics, and we'll walk through this. But basically, systematics, if we were to give that a definition, it's kind of like the field of science that is classifying organisms into groups based on their evolutionary relationships and taxonomical relationships. And so there's different ways of doing that. There's an evolutionary perspective or approach, there's a numerical approach, and there's a phylogenetic approach. So let's walk through these and what these actually mean, because they're all somewhat used still and can tell you some different things. The evolutionary approach is a hierarchical one, and it can show sort of the hierarchy of relationships, but also can show diversification. It tends to produce incomplete grouping, and we'll come back to what I mean by that. And it tends to be highly subjective. And so we're seeing an example of evolutionary sort of tree here based on the evolutionary relationships, and this is for vertebrates. And I think the thickness of the line is supposed to represent the diversity of these groups over time. Basically, you're just like researchers are sort of using a lot of accumulated knowledge to group these organisms using their own sort of understanding of how things work. And so it can be really, really subjective based off, where are you drawing the line between this group and this group, and you're making those decisions over and over again tends to produce some subjective, it's dependent on how the researcher is interpreting things, and everyone's different, and so that human subjectiveness gets implied into this. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always wrong, but it's kind of hard to say what's the true evolutionary relationship. We don't necessarily know that. So any of these are going to be different and represent different interpretations of the data. And so that's one drawback of this approach. The numerical approach arose as sort of a response to the subjectiveness of the evolutionary approach, where here the people who sort of created this approach wanted to get away from that subjectiveness, and so the method here is basically a numerical assignment to traits. And what that means is, for every trait that you can measure, that you can quantify in some way, you can assign numerical values to that, and you can sort of use just statistical analysis to group organisms based on their similarities. Basically, how similar are the numbers that you assign to these traits? And the thinking here is that organisms that are more similar using the traits that you're looking at must be related to one another. And so it's basically this approach to only use the data, let the data sort these groupings themselves, and not don't make any choices yourself. Just let the statistical programs do it themselves and see how that turns out. And it's meant to be this highly objective approach, as opposed to you as a researcher making choices. And that sounds really good when you say it, but if you give it a minute of thought, there are some situations where this isn't going to work very well. And so if you want to pause the video, there's one scenario in particular that we've talked about that could be a big problem for this. So if you want to, go ahead and pause the video and think for a second about, if you're grouping organisms based on the similarities of their traits, and you're assuming that if organisms get grouped together based on those similarities, that they must be related evolutionary to one another. What's a scenario where that could be a problem? So if you want to, go ahead and pause the video and think about that for a second. Okay, so if you were able to, or if you chose to pause the video, you may have thought about something that we talked about a number of times, which is convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is the evolution of similar traits in organisms that are not related to one another. So organisms that are on completely different parts of the planet, don't share a common ancestor anytime recent, develop these similar traits um, because of the similar evolutionary pressures that they're under. And so this sort of approach would look at those traits and say, oh, these are really similar. These organisms must be related to one another. And if you're not taking into account other things like where they're found, where the fossils were found, the timing of when organisms could have existed at completely different time periods. And so convergent evolution can be a big problem for this if you're not taking into the things that you know. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword where it's like, if you take into account these things that you know, then maybe you're making subjective decisions. But if you don't, then maybe you're leaving out something important. So it just depends. None of these approaches work all the time, which is why they're still in use. The last one is the phylogenetic one, and this is probably the one that I, I don't know how I want to say this. Like researchers, scientists really like this one. It's very elegant, but it's an evolution of derived traits. So basically, you're sorting these things using derived traits. So it's hierarchies based on character states. And what this means is that you use some characteristic, something that you can observe. It could be some morphological trait. It could be some gene. Or whatever it is, and you use sort of a presence absence. Like here you have the mammalian group, and there's several traits that evolved after the mammalian group and gave rise to these groups. So basically you're saying these things have these traits that these groups do not have, and so that's what you use to differentiate. And you can sort of just put things into their relationships, like in a relative sense, about whether they have certain traits or not. And that's really it. You're not assuming a timing thing, and you're just assuming relationships based on these character states. And so it's really simple, and it actually is pretty powerful. It doesn't work all the time. We still want to use other things that we might know, but this is sort of the backbone of cladistics. And it comes from this guy named Hennig, and we can walk through sort of let me walk through this really quickly just to sort of give you an idea of how this works. So if you have a cladogram here where you have these different groups, you usually have what's called an outgroup. So if you're looking at some trait or some character, we'll say this was what this A prime represents. It doesn't really matter, if you're having trouble like conceptualizing, this could be like the color of fur, or it could be body size, or whatever. It could be any trait that an organism could have. Basically, the outgroup here does not have it, and then this trait evolves, and all of these groups here do have it. So the outgroup doesn't have it. These groups all have it, and you could do it for other traits. You could say, we want to show what differentiates all these organisms from one another. So you have this outgroup based on trait A, and then trait B could be something else. Could be like the length of canines in predators, or who knows what it is. Could be anything. Basically, it's the same thing. You can plot that here and say, okay, these two differ from these groups based on the state of this trait or character. And you can do that for any given characteristic of a species or of an organism, and say, here's how it's related to these other groups based on a given trait. And you can end up with lots of different ways. And so you could have traits that differentiate things and traits that don't necessarily. Like down here in our this end one, we have this E and F characteristic that only evolved, E evolved only for this group too, and F evolved sort of twice, where you have it for 4 and 2. And so you're only really looking at traits that end up with a diversification that really lead to showing the evolutionary relationships, or the relative relationships to these different groups. It's a little bit tricky, but I think once you think about it for a little bit, it starts to click. Okay, so I sort of want to sort of build on that and look at some different types of groupings with cladograms, and this is just so you can understand maybe some terminology that might come up. So these are cladograms. We're going to look at three different groups or three different examples here that show different groups. So the first one is monophyletic, and these look complex, but it's really pretty simple once you realize what's going on here. So a monophyletic group is a group which that includes all ancestors, or I'm sorry, it's a group that includes the ancestor and all of its descendants. So you have two examples here. So basically, if you have ancestor 3, all of its descendants are in this group, and ancestor 2, all of its descendants are this group. So these would be monophyletic groups. Similar here, if you're looking at ancestor 4, and that you form this group, that's a monophyletic group because it has all of the descendants. And if you're looking at ancestor 1, this whole thing would be a monophyletic group because it has all of the descendants. So if you look at an ancestor and you have a group that has all the descendants, then that's a monophyletic group. Oops, these are out of order a little bit here. But anyway, so let's just, yeah, I'll just keep working here and I think we'll come back to that. But this is probably makes sense to have gone over this a little bit earlier anyway. So this is a simple phylogenetic tree and it illustrates the concepts of the in-group and the out-group and the special out-group that you might include there. So basically the in-group is the group that's under consideration. The sister group is sort of a group that includes a common ancestor. And an out-group is usually shown for additional context that doesn't have any of the characters or character traits that you're considering here. And this is basically just to show context, sort of put things in perspective. And add some additional information about where things are in an overall sense. So you might see this terminology referred to when we're looking at some of these cladograms. Okay, so going back to these, we introduced that monophyletic group, which was a group with an ancestor and all of its descendants. This is a paraphyletic, so this is a group that contains an ancestor and some, but not all of its descendants. So if you're looking at ancestor 2 here, and you have a group here, and you have a group here, those would be paraphyletic groups because they don't contain all of the ancestors. And it doesn't really matter if you're looking at ancestor 1 or 2 here. You know, if you look at ancestor 1, you have all these descendants, but not this one. And so both of these would be paraphyletic groups. Similar here, if you're looking at ancestor 3 or 4, this would be paraphyletic because you're not including these in the same group. And so that's basically the key. You have an ancestor, but some, but not all of the descendants are in a group. And then the last one here is polyphyletic. So polyphyletic are groups that require you to pass through one or more ancestor before reaching one that is shared by the group. So if you have a group here and you see that you have to pass through multiple ancestors to get back to a common ancestor of these two, then that's a polyphyletic group. Same thing here where you have organism or species T and B. You have to go through multiple ancestors to get back to one that they both share. So that's going to be a polyphyletic group. These are a bit tricky. So these three are monophyletic, paraphyletic, and polyphyletic. Take a little bit of time to sort of wrap your mind around. But I think the overall concepts make sense once you realize the overall relationships and how basically the anatomy of a cladogram works. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap up this video. Been going on for a little bit here. So there's a reading as usual. Keep working your way through the module, and I will see you in the next video.